Good afternoon, I'm Paul Vigna, a member of the edit board for PennLive.com and pinch hitting for John Mysick today, who's up in Erie, observing and then providing analysis on President Trump's visit there. We're very happy to have George Scott, who is running in the 10th Congressional District, first time in politics, grew up in Adams County in Littlestown, attended, let me see, Georgetown graduate, and majored in international politics, spent 20 years of his career in the U.S. Army, and retired as a lieutenant colonel, entered Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary, earned your master's in divinity, and has been a Lutheran minister in East Berlin for what,
since 2013.
2013, and did that before taking a leave of absence to get into politics and run for this congressional seat. So we welcome you today.
Thank you, Paul.
And as with all of our candidates who come in, we offer just a chance to speak on your behalf on sort of your vision and what message you'd like to get across to our viewers today. So.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's a real honor to be here with all of you.
Good. So let me ask you this then, to start off. We have reader panels where we'll sometimes say, in one word, sum up. So in one word, sum up what the last 6 months has been running for this seat.
I would use the word service, because that's what my life has been about. This is a continuation of that. I was raised by parents who spent their life serving. My father served 31 years actually, on active duty in the United States Army. My mother, who came over to the United States after World War II, served for 10 years in the newly formed International Monetary Fund. And then even after my dad retired and they settled on a family farm in south central Pennsylvania, they continued to serve in the local community. And so they were incredibly active. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, I really have an appreciation for it, whether it was scouting or the school board or Lions Club or the church. They were constantly in service. And so that ethic was instilled in me. It's an ethic that carried me through 20 years of active duty military service and through 9 years of ministry, and that continues to be the primary motivating force for me in this. And what I hear and see from people during the months that I've been campaigning is that that's really what they want from their elected leaders. They want basically to know that their elected representatives will work on their behalf, serve them, be kind of servant leaders is really what they're looking for, that they're going to work hard, and that they're going to fight for and watch out for their interests. And so in my mind, that's what this has all been about, is service.
You knew or know both Todd Platts and Bill Goodling?
I have actually never had the pleasure of meeting Todd, but I did know the late Representative Goodling. I had the honor of being a congressional intern for him during college.
Okay. Are there characteristics of how, of course he was long tenured, there's some characteristics that you drew from both that association and watching how he governed?
Well, I think he was always focused on what is best for the people right here in Pennsylvania. And there was no personal agenda that I ever sensed with him. He wasn't trying to promote himself. And of course, he had a strong background in education as both a teacher and as a principal. And so education was one of his top priorities, as well as jobs and making sure that people would be able to work and to live the kind of lives that they deserved. I always thought he was very down to earth. I never heard him badmouth anyone. He certainly disagreed, as I think everyone who's in elected office disagrees with others, both in their party and across the aisle. Right. But I never heard him speak ill of anyone, and so I admired that. I mean, you know, I was a Democrat, and as a young man, and still am, and always have been. But he was a Republican, but he took me and didn't treat me any differently from any of the other interns, and so I think that was that sense of looking for people to come together was something that I admired and hope to emulate.
Charlie, do you want to start off with one of yours?
Yeah, sure. Well, just appreciating your interest in continuing your life of service, and right now you think that you'd like to do that in Congress. The way our system works, in this case, you have to remove Scott Perry to get there. I'd like to ask you, I mean, I think by definition that means that if you were completely satisfied with Perry's representation in Congress, you wouldn't be running this year. What is your biggest criticism of Scott Perry and the work that he's done over the last 6 years for people in the 4th, now the 10th?
So I never try and make the elections about simply running against someone else. I think voters want something to vote for, and so I'm always trying to lead with that. Someone is something to vote for. But in terms of Mr. Perry, I was dissatisfied with what I saw, particularly as a minister. What I saw were a lot of people in the community who were being left behind, who were working harder than ever, and yet still struggling to make ends meet. And I didn't hear that being addressed by him or others, particularly others in the Freedom Caucus, which he affiliates himself with. It seemed to be a much more narrow focus on an agenda that was less about what the needs are of people here in South Central Pennsylvania, and more about the needs of particular groups in Washington, D.C. or in other parts of the country.
Talking about people here in South Central Pennsylvania, you have 2 cities in the 10th Congressional District, Harrisburg and New York, which have a lot of great selling points, a lot of great challenges. What would you do if you were elected specifically to help the cities of Harrisburg and New York?
Right, well, I've had great conversations with the mayors of both of those cities, with Mayor Pappenfuss and Mayor Helfrich, as well as with a number of council members in both of those cities, as well as community leaders. And so the place I always start is listen to the people who are on the ground and hear what their needs are, hear what their concerns are. The issues that I hear from them, and the ones that I think the federal government can help with, number one is with job creation. Too many of the folks in these cities don't have an opportunity to get a good paying job, and they get stuck in a cycle, particularly the people who are younger, where they don't have opportunities that are for good, strong legal employment with good wages, and they end up doing things which perhaps are illegal activity. And I know both of those mayors would like to see more economic activity. And so I think that part of what the federal government can do is assist with public-private partnerships. There's a lot of that already going on at the state level, and with a number of grants through DCED. I'd like to see the federal government reinforce those efforts for public-private partnerships. And one of the great ways to do that is through investments in infrastructure. Now, if you drive through our cities, or really anywhere through our district, you can see that we've got quite robust infrastructure, but it's an infrastructure that could use some repairs and upgrades. Some of that is due to the fact that you look at the 7881 corridor and the e-commerce. It was just, I believe in the paper today, that the e-commerce which is developed along this corridor, it's a good news story for us economically and for businesses, but it's creating a tremendous amount of pressure and stress on our infrastructure. And of course, creating infrastructure jobs is good, because economists will tell you that a dollar spent on infrastructure creates generally $3 to $5 of economic activity, and that's just for the short term. And then in the longer term, it enables businesses to reach places where they couldn't have reached otherwise. So I think that would be one of the first things: create better paying jobs, particularly through infrastructure investment. And while the federal government's role in public education is limited, I think it does have an important role, particularly in the pre-K education. We have programs like Head Start that have a tremendous impact, a positive impact. I'd like to see the federal government do a little more there for families that are economically disadvantaged, so that their kids can enter the school system and not already be behind at the age of 4 or 5.
You mentioned infrastructure on your campaign page. It's always a good topic. We know we need bridges and roads repaired, etc. You looked at all of where does that money come from, particularly with the current priorities at present?
Yeah, it's a great question. So traditionally, the federal government has led in infrastructure payments and investments. And traditionally, that model has been about 3/4 of the funds come from the federal level, and then the rest comes from either state, local, or private. The current administration has tried to reverse that formula, which frankly I think is unrealistic. To ask the private sector to come up with 3/4 of the bill for infrastructure investment without privatizing the infrastructure is I think unlikely. So one of the ways I think we could do it is take a relook at that tax bill, particularly the funds that went to the top 1% of our society. The statistics that I've seen indicate that about 83% of the benefits from the tax bill went to the top 1% of our society, both in terms of private citizens and in terms of businesses. I would rather have seen those funds go towards infrastructure development, so that rather than have a $1.9 trillion addition to our federal deficit, which is what that bill caused, that we would have those funds be spent on infrastructure. And so I think we should go back and relook that. Not so much at the cut for middle class, working class voters, but for those in the upper echelons of our society. Many of them didn't ask for that cut, and many of them have said they don't need it.
You launched your campaign back in the pre-primary season by famously burning an assault rifle on a bonfire.
Right.
And many of your detractors accused you of having an agenda to dismantle the Second Amendment. Can you kind of bring us to speed on where you stand on the gun issue and what you would do in Washington?
Sure. So first, I want to state that I've been running actually since May of 2017, doing it part-time while I was doing full-time ministry all the way up to this February when I took an unpaid leave of absence. And we did run one commercial during the primary. It was the one you talked to. We did it in part because for tactical reasons, because we had a 4-person primary with 4 candidates, all of whom were relatively unknown, and we recognized that we needed to find an issue that would resonate strongly with voters in the primary. In terms of this specific issue of weapons and guns and the Second Amendment, what I always remind folks is I completely support the Second Amendment, as I do every other part of our Constitution. I have no desire to overturn the Second Amendment. But what I do want to have is a long overdue conversation amongst all of us, a common sense conversation about gun violence, because we've got a major problem in our nation with gun violence. We see it most notably with these mass shootings in schools and churches and public gatherings. But of the 96 people that get killed on average every day from guns, the majority of those are suicides, actually. Suicides done by gun owners. And so this is an alarming issue in many ways. And so what I would like to see is I'd like to see us start the conversation first by understanding what it is we're dealing with. And I think one of the best ways to do that with a public safety issue, a public health issue, is to go to the Centers for Disease Control. They're the most respected institution for public health, public safety issues, and have them do an in-depth study so that we can have an evidence-based approach where we all start with a common baseline of knowledge to figure out how we're going to solve this. Secondly, I'd like us to make sure we know that a person that's receiving a weapon is a person who should be receiving a weapon. And the simplest way to do that is through universal background checks, which are supported by over 85%, some surveys show 90% of Americans. And that simply says that before someone receives a weapon, we run a simple check that makes sure they don't have a violent criminal record or a serious mental health issue. Again, the vast majority of Americans support that. I also think we need to talk about lethality. When the Second Amendment was drafted, the most common weapon was a musket. And the rate of fire of a musket was, for a really good person, one round every 30 to 40 seconds. Now, we've got weapons that, if they're modified, can put dozens of rounds out in the space of less than a minute. And so it's a different world we live in. And so I think things like bump stocks, which convert semi-automatic weapons to automatic weapons, should not be available. We need to ban those. High-capacity magazines, these magazines that hold 50 rounds or more. I don't think we really need those either. I mean, if we want to have them at a range where somebody can go and have that experience of what is it like to fire off 50 rounds in a minute, okay, that's fine. But if you're hunting and you need a 50-round magazine, maybe you need to go back to the range and practice a little bit before you go out hunting. And then, of course, we've got rifles which were intended for use on the battlefield, and which have an incredible lethality. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about who should have those weapons and where should those weapons be present in public spaces. I certainly, as a father of a son who's in high school and a daughter who's in college, I don't want those weapons anywhere near the schools that my kids are in or the schools that anybody else's children are in. I don't want them anywhere near my congregation. So again, understand the issue, know who's receiving a weapon, try and reduce the lethality, and then certainly we need to protect places that are vulnerable, our schools, our churches, and other places. But I think we leave that decision to local officials. They know best what works and doesn't work. I don't think it's a great idea to arm teachers. The overwhelming majority of teachers I talk to say, I'm already trying to do too much. I don't need that added to my plate. At the end of the day, here's the analogy that I found is very, very helpful. If you remember the 1960s, we had a lot of cars where we had accidents that resulted in deaths and serious injuries. And so we had a national dialogue that started. And that national dialogue led us to installing seatbelts, and then airbags, and then crash tests, and then improving driver training and certification. None of that was designed to eliminate cars. It was designed to make driving a safer experience. And I think that's the national dialogue that we need to have when it comes to guns and gun violence, is how do we make this safer? Not to take weapons away from law-abiding gun owners, but to make our society safer.
Just to follow up real quick then, would you support then an assault weapons ban that was in effect years ago?
Yeah, I would certainly be willing to consider restrictions on assault weapons, and of course there's a lot of folks that dispute what is the definition of an assault weapon, so that would need to be part of that. But I don't think everyone needs to have a weapon that's meant for use on the battlefield. So yeah, I do think we need to look at that, but I'm open to the discussion of what does right look like for that particular part of it.
In an area where there are a lot of gun owners, what kind of dialogue have you had with people? Because I can imagine there are a lot of people that are more supportive of what exists now versus some of the things that you talked about.
Actually, the vast majority of gun owners that I've talked with agree that we've got a major problem with gun violence. They agree with that. They don't want to see mass shootings in schools and churches and public gatherings. They don't want to see suicides by fellow gun owners. And of course, none of us want to see the violence, the shooting like it's happening, for example, right now in York. York's had, I think it's 7 shootings just in the past month alone, with several fatalities from that. So I think when I talk with gun owners and make it clear to them that, look, I'm not trying to overturn the Second Amendment. I want us to have this conversation about reducing gun violence. They relax and they're like, yeah, we really need to do something about this. And their willingness in terms of how far they're willing to go varies from person to person, but all of them do recognize that we have an issue with gun violence and that we need to have a dialogue about it.
Could I ask you a question about tariffs and trade policy? In the debates and when he was here with us, Representative Perry did seem to say that he doesn't like tariffs as a policy, but you get the sense that he's willing to give the Trump administration some room to move on this because he's open to the idea that maybe we will get better trade deals out of sort of like short-term pain for long-term gain. What do you think about the move toward tariffs that President Trump has taken and Congress's role in that? Would you like to see if Congress have more of a say in it, like that Corker bill that was proposed? Your thoughts on that? Are you let you go?
Yeah, well, I think in general, tariffs should not be the first choice for trade policy, which the current administration has seemed to make them that first choice. They alienate other nations, and more importantly, they cause some serious difficulties, in some cases economic loss for people right here at home. In many ways, it's a de facto tax upon people within our own nation. And I think that there are certainly bad actors in international trade, China being foremost among them. And we do need to aggressively go after those folks that are not complying with international trade agreements. And the World Trade Organization is the primary means to do that, not the sole means. The United States actually has had a very successful record. I believe it's 91% of the cases that we brought before the WTO have been ruled in our favor. And so I think that's the first course to go to. I think multilateral agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA, are other means to go after trade issues. But if we are in a position where we feel like we really need to pursue tariffs, then we need to do it in a very selective nature and in a deliberative nature. And I think if we're going to do tariffs for national security reasons, which is what the current administration has chosen, then I think Congress can and should have a voice in that. And so Senator Corker introduced a bill, and there's a version in the House of Representatives as well. It's bipartisan, which says if it's going to be a tariff introduced for national security reasons, then it has to go before the Congress for review. That's the kind of piece of legislation that I would certainly co-sponsor and which my opponent has not.
Mr. Scott, do you feel like the current world order as it pertains to trade has been working for America? Because like you grew up in Littlestown, right? Mm-hmm. I'll bet you in Littlestown there's probably some old manufacturing plant that has closed in the last, maybe several of them have closed in the last generation. I mean, yeah, we have had this era of free trade and NAFTA and everything, but every town that every one of us is from can probably point to that old factory, nobody works there anymore. And is it possible that maybe there is a better model out there than just going and taking a case before the World Trade Organization or crafting a new deal like NAFTA? Mm-hmm. I don't know what you think about that. I mean, any thoughts about any better ways to go forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. There certainly are businesses where I grew up. I can think of Latonian Shoe, which was one of the major employers, which went out of business a number of years ago, and I think some of that was due to trade agreements that were enacted. And yet, at least based upon the information that I've read, we've lost as many or more jobs due to automation over the years as we have due to trade agreements. And so what we've got is we've got an economy which is going through significant change. It's almost a new age in terms of our economic outlook and our economic orientation. And so trying to structure agreements that will allow us to go back towards that, it may work for a while, but I think we need to look for ways to move forward. So I'll use one example that comes to mind. I visited a company in York called York Exponential. And it's a group of folks that working through public-private partnerships have established a plant there in York. And their idea is to draw upon York's well-deserved reputation and history as a hub of manufacturing, but to do that for the robotics sector. Because as the owner explained to me, robotics, oftentimes we think of PhD candidates and people who are doctoral level writing code. But much of that code now is written by the machines. And so what we need, he said, is folks who are highly skilled laborers who understand that when you're going to do a job, here are the steps required to do that and do that where it meets satisfaction, not just of the worker, but also of the consumer. And so they're designing robots ideally for mass scale production, which can then be used in the economy using skilled labor from right here within York and tapping into the information infrastructure which passes through York. I think agreements and efforts that go in that direction, that recognize that we're in an information-based economy are a big part of it. I think another part of it are also recognizing that we have perhaps gone too far in our educational model towards insisting on the value of a 4-year degree. And not everyone is ideally going to be having a 4-year degree. Some folks don't want that. That isn't what their skill set is. And so perhaps there's ways that we can better enhance and support career and technical education. I know Senator Casey introduced a bill recently, a bipartisan bill, to do just that. And we see those efforts already going on in the district with programs like York Tech and Cumberland Perry, as well as other places. That's, I think, where we need to focus more of our effort on. We can't solve the economy and the challenges that we face simply through tariffs and through penalizing trade competitors, and certainly we don't want to penalize and alienate allies like Canada and nations in the European Union, nations which have been our partners not just economically but diplomatically and militarily for decades. These are critical relationships that we need to protect and preserve.
With Brett Kavanaugh joining the Supreme Court, a lot of people who oppose abortion rights are seeing a new opportunity to overturn Roe versus Wade. I just wondered if you could talk about your view on abortion rights, particularly not just as candidate, but also as a pastor, how this reconciles, how you view abortion rights.
Yeah, it's clearly one of the most challenging and most divisive issues that exists within our nation and has been for a long time. And people on both sides of the issue have very deep emotional feelings about it. And so, again, it's an issue that tends to divide people, which is why I don't focus my time on it very much, because I want to bring people together. I want to focus on issues that will allow people to see improvements in their lives on a day-to-day basis, which is why I usually spend most of my time talking about things like healthcare and jobs and education and Social Security and Medicare. But I do believe that it's important to maintain a woman's right to choose, and I do want that to be safe, to be legal, and ideally to be rare. And the rare part is because as a pastor, I believe in the sanctity of life. Now how do we make that rare? Not by putting obstacles in the way of women, but rather by equipping them so that they're never in the situation where they feel that they need to make that terrible choice, where they first of all are equipped with family planning resources so that they don't have a pregnancy which is unplanned in the first place. Secondly, that they have affordable, accessible health care so that when they do realize they're pregnant, they can get in to see the doctor. The doctor can provide them with the prenatal care and maternity care that they need. And then that once they're back in, they can know that once they're back in the workforce, they're going to be able to have equal pay and be able to bring in the kind of wages that they need in order to be able to support a family. And that there's going to be child care available for them which they can afford. I think if we equip women with those types of resources, then it decreases the likelihood that any woman's ever going to be faced with that choice. And the last piece I think I would add to that is I would like to see us streamline the process for adoption in our nation. Folks that I know of who've tried to adopt children have told me it's a very complex, very drawn out, and very expensive process. And anytime we can provide a child with a home, I think that's something that we want to do.
The United Nations this week issued a dire report on climate change and the impact of climate change and our inability to really curb the carbon emissions and the consequences to the globe. As a member of Congress, will you push the laws or legislations and policies that might have an impact on that course?
Yes, I will. I absolutely will. So I think it's important to not simply preserve the legislative landmarks that have enabled us to have clean air and clean water and the Endangered Species Act. We have to recognize that climate change is a real, substantial threat. It's the single greatest long-term threat to our globe, and we have to react accordingly. And so one of the things that I was brought on board with early on is what's called the carbon fee and dividend approach. And I credit folks from Citizens Climate Lobby for taking the time to sit down with me and walk me through this. But essentially what it says is, and again, I want to say up front, this is not a tax. This is a fee and dividend. The way it works is a fee is put upon any carbon-producing fuel, either at the point of production or the point of entry into the United States. and that fee is well publicized in advance, it's predictable, and it gradually goes up over time. And that fee is collected and then distributed to consumers as a dividend. So it's revenue neutral. There's nobody taking money and making money off of this, and consumers aren't being penalized. But what it does is over the course of a decade, it steadily increases the cost of fossil producing fuels. Now what does that do for businesses and governments who tend to be the largest consumers of fossil fuels? It helps them to understand that, okay, my costs are going to go up steadily for fossil fuels. It creates an incentive then for them for market forces, for market reasons, to move away from that, to move towards renewable sources of energy. And so the data and the analysis that they provided with me and that I've seen from others as well indicates that over the course of 10 years, an approach like that would, number one, reduce carbon emissions probably by about a third, which I know is one of the goals that the UN report cited we have to get to. I believe it was a 50% reduction by 2040 in order to avoid the rise we're talking for. So this would take us a third of the way there. In addition, they believe it would create 2.1 million new jobs in the renewable energy sector. And that's one of the fastest growing sectors across the nation, one that I think we here in Pennsylvania should invest in and benefit from. And on top of that, it would reduce the illnesses and deaths that come from pollution-related causes. And of course, with a nation where our healthcare costs are going up steadily, that's something that I would certainly support as well.
If I may add to that.
Yes.
President Trump has been very supportive of the coal industry and has vowed to continue to implement policies that are supportive to the coal industry. What do you say to that sector of the industry as it relates to future plans to cut carbon emissions?
Well, I think that, first of all, unless I miss something, we don't have any coal production going on here within the 10th Congressional District. So my focus is on the voters of this congressional district, and the coal industry is not an employer within the district. So I would simply say that coal, like any other carbon emissions producing fuel, should be in that category, where a carbon fee and dividend would gradually increase the price over time.
You're certainly familiar growing up with agriculture. Where are we now, both locally and nationally, in terms of how life is for farmers and what needs to happen?
Yeah, it's so I was fortunate enough to last week sit down with Congresswoman Sherry Bustos, who was passing through the area. She's from Illinois, has a lot of agricultural activity in her district. She's on the House Agricultural Committee, and she and myself and Denny Wolf, who you may know, who's running for Congress as well, as a former PA Secretary of Agriculture, we sat down and talked about these issues. And I think the consensus from all of us is that agriculture continues to be one of the most important sectors for our nation, and it's certainly one of the most important sectors right here in Pennsylvania. It's the single largest source of GDP within the district. And yet what we see and what I hear when I talk to farmers individually, when I visited the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, is that there's a lot of deep concern about the long-term prospects. Some of that is caused to is due to the forces on family farmers. Family farmers increasingly are finding it difficult to stay viable. There seems to be a preference towards larger farms, farming as a corporate activity. I think we need to take a hard look at that here within South Central Pennsylvania to see, can we better support family farms and the culture and values that goes with that, as well as with all they do for production. Beyond that, what I've heard from farmers is that they're being devastated by these tariffs. The prices for milk, for soybeans, and for other crops have dropped significantly, in some cases by 20%. And that's devastating to a farmer. And so we need to, again, this is one of the reasons why I think, Charlie, coming back to your question, we need to seriously relook these tariffs, because they're hurting people right here in South Central Pennsylvania. And I'd like to see us move away from that. We're the largest exporter of agricultural products in the world. And so I want to make sure that we continue to support our farmers and enable them to do that. Beyond that, I think the lesson we can learn from Pennsylvania is that when I was growing up as a kid on the farm, when you thought agriculture, you thought dairy farming and beef cattle and maybe a crop or two. our agricultural industry here in Pennsylvania is incredibly diverse. We're the largest producer of mushrooms in the United States. When I found that out a couple of years ago, I was like, when did that happen? And we see it even right here in the district. We've got people growing crops that they never did when I was a kid. So that kind of innovation, I think we want to support farmers, and we want to make sure that the Farm Bill gets passed, that it's not held hostage to things like building a wall on the border of Mexico. That doesn't have anything to do with the Farm Bill. We need to make sure the Farm Bill gets passed so that farmers have the degree of price support and stability that they need in order to be effective in the long run.
So a good segue to that maybe might be to talk about immigration, because I wanted to ask you, Perry has said that he was for what is known in Washington as the Goodlatte bill, and I have a little cheat sheet here about that. I believe, if I understand that correctly, because there's a lot of immigration proposals around that would have extended DACA. It would have had money for a wall. It would have made employers use E-Verify. And but one of the amendments that they were trying to insert into that bill that Perry is for, he's talked about it in the debates, is a 3-year visa program for agricultural workers. So it's a stew of issues that answers that answer a lot of the questions in an immigration debate. I was just curious, he was for that. Would you have been for that particular bill if you were in Congress?
Yeah, so I have not read the particulars of that individual bill. As you said, there's been a lot of bills on immigration. Certainly many of the components that you just mentioned are things that I support. We need to create a pathway to citizenship for those who are here right now underneath DACA. We do need to figure out a way to provide better visas, particularly for agricultural workers. The visa program right now creates a number of difficulties for growers and farmers right here within South Central Pennsylvania. And so a longer-term visa program, I think, should be considered and modified. Above and beyond that, what I would say is we need a comprehensive approach to immigration that's bipartisan, that will bring in folks from both sides and recognize that immigration is at the core of who we are as a nation. You know, we're all immigrants. Unless you're 100% Native American. And so that's been one of our greatest strengths as a nation. We've got an economy right now that is, economists would say, is close to full employment. We've got about 300,000 baby boomers retiring every month. So our need for qualified, skilled labor is not going away anytime soon. And since our growth rate is not, our population growth rate is not going up, how do we meet that need?
Yeah.
We're going to need immigrants in order to come in.
Yeah, one other important facet of that Goodlatte bill that I left out, as I understand it, would have cut legal immigration levels. So part of the deal was we will extend a hand to DACA, but as I understand it, that would have reduced legal immigration, placed some new limits on that.
Yeah, which I wonder how does that work? Again, just look at the economic situation. We're at about 4% unemployment, and we've got 300,000 baby boomers retiring every month. So the available workforce is shrinking over time. And even right here within South Central Pennsylvania, you can talk to business owners, and right now, oftentimes one of their challenges is finding skilled, qualified workers. And so is decreasing immigration the right approach to that? I mean, certainly I think there may be some folks who have checked out of the workforce due to discouragement over the years. We need to figure out how to revitalize them and bring them back in. There may be other workers that are in jobs that are not paying them the wages that they need. We can build worker training programs to allow them to transition to something new. But in the long run, the numbers are what the numbers are. And if our workforce population is going down each year, and we also decrease illegal immigration, well, what is that going to do? That's going to cause the prices for labor to go up. And frankly, prices for labor do need to go up. Wages for middle class and working class people here in the United States have been relatively flat over the years, and have not kept pace with inflation, and certainly have not kept pace with the wages for those at the very top end of the economic scale. But we've got to be careful. We could quickly create a situation where we have a return of inflation as wages go up faster than people would like.
You mentioned healthcare is a big concern for Americans. If you're elected, what would be your priorities in terms of helping ensure there's affordable healthcare?
Right. It is not only a priority for Americans. I would say it's the number one priority that I hear of from people here in the district. Rarely do I go to an event where someone doesn't come up to me and ask me a question about healthcare or tell me a story about healthcare. So, for example, there was a couple. I was over in East Pennsboro on Saturday for the Pumpkin Fest, which is a great event, by the way. And they came up and they talked to me, and he's a small business owner, and his wife worked with him in the small business. But they got to the point where they couldn't do that any longer because their health insurance costs had gone up to $2,300 a month. And so she is now in a different job, working full-time in order to bring in an additional income to help them cover those costs. So this is an issue that is affecting people's lives. It's the kind of issue that keeps people awake at night. It's the issue that I heard about quite often as a minister, as a pastor, and again, I hear about on the campaign trail. So for me, at the end of the day, what we want is affordable, accessible, quality health care for every American. The question then becomes, how do we get there? And I've always believed that the best way is to define what you want to achieve at the end, find people who believe in that similar vision of what you want to achieve, and then you can sit down and work on the ways and means to get there. In the short term, we've got to stabilize the system that we've got right now. The Affordable Care Act, which was by no means perfect, did extend insurance to over 20 million Americans who didn't have it beforehand, and so it did a lot of good. But the current Congress has made some changes to that program. They were not able to repeal it, but they made changes to it that have destabilized it and that have caused prices to go up rather than come down, and have caused the number of insurance providers to decrease. So there's markets where sometimes now there's only one provider, which was not the intent of the system. So I want to see us stabilize the Affordable Care Act and repair it in those places where it needs to be repaired. And if changing the name helps to get support for that, then let's change the name, because I think there's some folks that are really hung up on the name more than they are on the content of the bill. Beyond that, we've got to figure out a way to look towards something that will give us that end state, which is a word I know my team hates me using, but it's exactly the right word. It's what do we want to have at the end of this. And so one thing that I'd like to see is give us serious consideration to a Medicare buy-in option. Now why that? Well, number one, Medicare is a proven program, and it's a program that the majority of seniors, in fact, I would say anecdotally, the overwhelming majority of seniors that I talk to are fairly satisfied with. Many of them have supplemental programs or some type of additional, but as their baseline care, Medicare they're happy with. So what I also found is that there's a lot of people in our society who are in their 50s who would like to have some other option than their employer health plan. Oftentimes they want to transition perhaps to a new way of work, but they can't do it because they don't want to give up their health care. And so with Medicare buy-in option, the way that would work would be people would be able to enter Medicare early, say at age 50 or 55, but there would be an upfront buy-in cost. And for that, they would then enter a system that was proven, and it would enable the system to expand gradually. It wouldn't be something that was forced upon them. They'd make their own choice with their wallets or their purses, and then we could reinforce that where it's successful and make changes where it's not working out. I was actually at an event last night, and a gentleman said to me, he said, could businesses participate in that buy-in option? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I know business owners, and he was one, but he said, I know business owners who one of their greatest costs is health care for their employees who are over the age of 50. And he said, I think there's many of them that would welcome an option to be able to help someone transition into Medicare early so that cost is not being borne by their business any longer. So I think this is a great way to gradually build support towards some type of single-payer option. But at the end of the day, I'll work with anyone from either party to come up with a solution that will achieve that desired outcome of affordable, accessible, quality health care.
Now, if you had that sort of a buy-in option for Medicare, is that sustainable? I mean, is there a potential of that could make Medicare just collapse under the added cost to it?
I think we need to work through those numbers as part of the legislation. I do not have those numbers at hand, so that would be one of the things that I'd want to sit down with folks in the Congressional Research Service as well as folks in the medical community to see what are the costs that we're looking at if we do this.
One last healthcare follow-up.
Yes,
Should
sir.
insurers be required to cover pre-existing conditions?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Not only cover them, but cover them at rates that people can afford. And I understand that that's, difficult, makes it difficult financially for some of the insurance companies, but that was part of the reason for the Affordable Care Act for the price supports, was so that insurers would be able to insure people with pre-existing conditions that might not be economically feasible otherwise. Yes, sir.
If I can circle back to one thing that we talked about at the very start, you mentioned in one of your answers the tax bill, and 83% of the benefit of that bill going to the wealthiest 1% in America. And you said reroute that to infrastructure. But one of the things you kind of criticized the tax bill for was the $1.9 trillion that it adds to the national debt.
Mm-hmm.
So if you took that money, I just want to clarify on this. If you took that money and you sort of reformed the tax cut bill and pumped money, created a stream to fund infrastructure projects,
Mm-hmm.
would we still be left with the 1.9 trillion? I mean, are you saying that you can live with the 1.9 trillion deficit number, or are you?
No, I'm not. I think we need to be fiscally responsible. I certainly always want to be fiscally responsible once I'm elected, and if we're going to pursue initiatives, that we've got a way to pay for them, and that we're not hoping that the economy is going to grow at enough of a rate to generate additional revenues, which is really what that plan did. It said, well, we're going to make all these cuts in anticipation that the economy is going to grow enough to make that up. And of course, the Congressional Budget Office has come out, and even their most optimistic estimates say it comes nowhere close making up for that gap. So that 1.9 trillion was essentially a decrease in revenues coming into the federal government. And again, much of that decrease benefits large corporations and the wealthiest people in our society. If those revenues are restored to the federal government, those revenues then become available for the federal government to use for other programs, which could, and I would say should, include infrastructure spending. Again, infrastructure spending, the baseline figure is $1 spent on infrastructure creates another $3 to $5 of economic activity. So I don't think it's creating a deficit. It's rather just simply saying revenues that were forecasted to come in would return, and then those revenues would be able to be used for programs that would benefit the nation as a whole. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Can I assume you feel like, coming from a religion background, having been as a minister, feel like you can bridge the chasm a little bit in terms of civility and crossing the aisle? You mentioned it with Goodling. I mean, how realistic is that, considering every year it gets worse?
Yeah. For me, it is one of the biggest parts of this calling, is to try and not only campaign, but once elected, participate in the governing process in a civil way. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to get out of this mess overnight either. And there's a lot of contributing factors to the lack of civility. I think the extreme gerrymandering of districts has been part of that. And we're fortunate in Pennsylvania that we've moved away from that quite a bit. So I do think it's a basic part of the call. So I've served in the military. I've served in the federal government after I retired from the military. I've worked in the private sector, and now I've been in ministry. Every time that I was able to accomplish something, or was part of an organization that accomplished something significant, it was because of personal relationships. It was more than simply, hey, I've never met you before, but now we're going to do something together. It was part of forming personal relationships. And so I think that's part of what's missing in our government today is we've got elected representatives that don't spend the time on personal relationships. We've got to reinvest in those personal relationships. And from there, I think we've got to figure out a way to disagree without demonizing those who disagree with us. And I understand that's a lot easier said than done, but gosh, I hear that desire more than anything else, even more than healthcare. I hear people saying, I'm so sick of our politics with people just arguing and insulting each other and not getting things done. I think it's at the very core of what people want, and it's the very core of why I'm running. And I do think ministry has equipped me well for that. You know what's one of the most important quality to be a successful pastor is being able to listen. It is the single most important quality, is just listen to people. And I think in our political culture, listening is largely lost. And so I want to listen, not just to people who think the way I do, but for people who have ideas that are different from mine, to see if we can find a common ground.
Plenty of seniors and people who are going to be seniors are worried about the solvency of Social Security. What would you do to help stabilize Social Security going forward if you're elected?
Yeah. So the good news is there is no deficit when it comes to Social Security. It is a program which is currently solvent. It does have a point, and I'm trying to remember when that comes, but it's within the foreseeable future where we anticipate they won't be able to meet all the obligations fully. And I believe that Social Security, much like Medicare, is a promise that we've made to our seniors that we need to continue to fulfill. The solvency issue is in no small part created by the fact that we have a cap. And that cap says that any income over $128,000 for someone who's filing single, or over $256,000 for someone who's filing joint, that none of that income is subject to the tax which supports Social Security. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if there's someone who's fortunate enough to be making $128,000 a year, which is a pretty good salary in the area where we live, if the person in the next neighborhood over is making $128 million a year, they're paying the same exact amount towards Social Security. If we lift that cap completely, we would stabilize the Social Security system for another roughly 30 to 40 years. And so I think that needs to be part of the conversation, is either partially or fully lifting that cap to create a level playing ground where everyone's paying their fair share. And I think that's all folks want. Folks don't want, we don't want our neighbors carrying a larger burden. We want them carrying whatever's proportional. And you know, what my faith teaches me is this. We're supposed to love God, we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. And part of loving our neighbors as ourselves is making sure that the neighbor in need is helped. And our seniors need help. And we need to make sure that Social Security, which they rely on, continues to be there, not just for the next few years, but into the foreseeable future.
Mr. Scott, you've several times in the course of the campaign kind of aligned yourself as somebody who's very pro-public education. And I'm just curious, I mean, you know, typically we always kind of operate under the assumption that, like, most of what's going on in public education is kind of set at the state level with a lot of funding coming from the local level. And the federal government is kind of the weakest leg of the three-legged stool on that. Do you have any ideas or any thoughts about, like, if you were elected in Congress, are there things that you're thinking about policy-wise that would go to strengthening public education as a member of the U.S. Congress?
Right.
And what would they be, if you have any ideas you want to bring to the table on that?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we can do is restore some of the checks and balances. Right now we have one party in control of not just the executive branch, but also both parts of the legislative branch. And for whatever reason, this current Congress has not chosen to provide much of a check on the administration. And one of the places we see that is with educational policies. The Secretary of Education is pursuing policies that frankly aren't really designed to support public education, which is a core part of the Department of Education's charter. So I think once elected, I would want to make sure that I and others in Congress are providing that check, providing that oversight on those policies and procedures. Stepping back into funding, I think the federal government, the most common figure I see, provides about 8% of the total revenue stream towards education. And that revenue stream has been, and I think should continue to be, designed to set the conditions for success in education at the state and local level. And some of the successes of that are programs such as Head Start, the National School Lunch Program, which I've seen is very much needed within this district. Title I funds, which are given to communities that have economically disadvantaged students in significant numbers. I'd like to see the federal government reinforce that, and particularly for something like pre-K education, even expand that slightly to again equip children as best as possible for success in their educational outcomes. And above and beyond that, I think one of the most important things the federal government can do is listen to and work with folks at the local level. And that's not just state and local elected officials. It's also the teachers and the administrators and the support staff that are in these schools. They know what's going on far better than anyone in Washington, D.C. And so I would want to make sure that I'm talking to them and, more importantly, listening to them on a regular basis.
This is such a red-hot election season. All eyes are on the midterms. I'd like to get an idea of how much contact you have with the national party. Are people coming in to help you? How much give and take is there? Because obviously this is considered one of the tightest races in the state or in the country.
Yeah, it is definitely one of the tightest races, and it's started to get increasing levels of attention since the primary, and I suspect that's going to continue into the general election. We have heard on a regular basis from folks at the national level providing words of, first of all, encouragement, which as a candidate I will tell you is very helpful. Also advice, the folks from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee came in the month after the primary victory and sat down with me and with my team and said, okay, let's talk about what you did in the primary and what worked and what didn't work, and what are some areas where you can improve on. What those of us who've spent time in the military would recognize as an after-action review. And so we talked about ways to improve in everything from our field operations to our fundraising to the way we were organized. And in those cases where that meant expanding our team, which we did expand our team, they had some suggestions about folks, that they thought were here in Pennsylvania that might be able to help. And so we've got a team now that is overwhelmingly composed, as it was in the primary, of people from right here in Pennsylvania, but people who are very committed to supporting a very competitive race in an area that oftentimes people don't think of as competitive. So I welcome that. I have found it to be helpful. At the end of the day, the decisions about the campaign are made by me and made by my campaign team, and our focus has been, is, and will continue to be on what's best for the voters and the people of the 10th Congressional District. That's why I'm running. I'm going to work for them. I'm not going to work for the party, and the party knows this. I will work for the people of this district. Just, it's the same pledge that Connor Lamb made out in Western Pennsylvania the first time he ran. Those words I could put right in front of me and read with 100% confidence.
As a military veteran, I'm sure you're interested in funding for the military. Obviously, President Trump has directed more money to the Defense Department, some expense to civilian agencies. Are we at a point now where the military has the funding it needs? Do you think the military needs more funding, or is it time to maybe focus on some other civilian domestic programs?
Right, so the sequestration process,
Say
that's
that
a mouthful, yeah. That was a bipartisan effort to try and control costs, and I think the military paid a price because of that process. In particular, because the the level of operations has continued to be quite high, and so the personnel tempo, the operations tempo, has taken a toll on our nation's armed forces. One of the people on my staff, he's like me, a retired Army officer. He's got a daughter who's a young lieutenant at Fort Hood, Texas, and she was telling him about some of the issues they have with keeping their equipment up and running, and then what a challenge that is. So I'm happy to see that we've put more funds towards the Department of Defense to improve the operations, the maintenance, and the readiness of our forces. But I think part of this is, as we look at it over the long term, we have to take a hard look at the military operations and the footprint that we've got and the costs that are associated with that. When I entered the service on active duty in 1984, we had 4 deployed forces, over 300,000 in Germany. But when the Cold War fell, we resized that, we reshaped that effort and drew that down to match what was the level of threat and the level of readiness and force projection that we needed coming out of Europe. I think we are now, 17 years in post 9/11, and I think it's time to really relook the footprint that we've got, as well as the force structure, and see, is this really what we need to look at our national goals and objectives for our national security strategy, translate those, the federal government translate those into the national military strategy, and then to design a force structure and build the spending plan to support that. But I don't think unlimited spending on defense is the right way to go. I've worked in the private sector to include with defense contractors. I will tell you that there is some degree of excess amongst defense contractors, and there's some ways that we could get a better bang for our buck, at least in that sector.
Do you see any situation where there could be time to pull back the number of bases, even domestically within the U.S.? Like base closing sometimes is a big concern for communities.
Base realignment and closure process is always incredibly difficult, and certainly here in the 10th Congressional District, we've got some bases which are key, not just for the district, but for our forces as well. Carlisle Barracks with its educational and training mission, the Navy Depot with its supply readiness for our naval forces are both critical. There may be a time when the BRAC process needs to be re-energized. I honestly can't say whether or not we're at that time or not. I don't have that information.
Okay, I think we have pretty much gone our full hour, so
Great.
George, thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Best of luck the rest of the way.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great questions and for your patience with me.